Okay. Um, Welcome to the Quizzical Spirit Book Talk podcast. I'm Ross Hightower.
And I'm Deb Heim.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about story structure.
Story structure.
Yeah. Uh, so, um, if you're writing a highbrow literary novel, you can basically do anything you want. Um, I mean, there may be rules, but I don't know what they are. But if you're writing what's called a genre novel, which includes things like fantasy, sci-fi, romance, action adventure, etc., then there's a certain structure that you're supposed to follow. And some of the sources I've read said if you don't follow that structure, no one's going to read your book, which I think is BS. But if you, anytime there are rules, if you stray from the rules, you got to have a pretty good reason. So that structure is you have three acts, and the first act is sort of the normal world, right? The existing world when the book starts. You get to know your antagonist. You get to know what their want is, which basically means there's something they want that they can't have. Uh, and if you don't have that, you basically don't have a book, right? If everything's hunky dory, then why read? Um, then at about 25%, you have an inciting incident. And that is something that happens that forces the protagonist out of their normal world. Right. Um, you have the second act, which is about 50% of the book, where things get progressively worse for your protagonist. That everything happens, that every time something happens, it gets worse and worse. And then at about 75%, you have the climax. And then you have the last 25% of the book. It's just kind of the conclusion, pulling everything together. That's called the three-act structure, and it's a structure that most genre books follow. Um, so the question is, do our books follow that structure?
Well, that is quite a good question. The first book that you had published, Spirit Light, can you pull that book up?
Yeah, Spirit Sight,
Spirit Sight.
right?
The
This was
original,
right the original version of that
turn
book,
it
and you can see,
sideways,
yeah,
800 and pages.
right,
And to be honest, somebody needed to tell him to split it in two.
right. So a
And
reviewer on YouTube says, "Who does he think he is? Stephen King or George R. R. Martin?"
well, he is gonna be, but not yet. So this is
Right.
first book out of the gate, and it's it's long.
Yeah, it's a long book.
However, it
Right.
does follow the narrative structure.
Yeah. And wrote most of this before I even knew what that structure was. And it turns out that the inciting incident happens at almost exactly 25%, and the climax happens at almost exactly 75%. And it's only because I read so many books before this, I sort of had a kind of an intuitive feel for how books work, right? So it follows that narrative structure. Uh, and then my publisher, it was out for a while, and my publisher emailed me and says, "You know what? It's really hard to market a book this long." And
And so he recommended you split it into two. So how
or
did
split it
you,
into
or
multiple
split
books,
it
right?
somehow? How did you then continue with that narrative structure, given that you were splitting a book that fit the narrative structure into two books? How did you
You,
do that? Or
you
did you?
can't. There's no way. I mean, especially with a book like Spirit Sight, which has multiple subplots, right, or parallel plot lines. You can't do that. And I sort of wish that I had known all of this when I was writing it. I might have
Coulda,
written,
shoulda, woulda.
yeah, I know. I would have maybe written it as a trilogy all by itself.
Hmm.
So then I would have the Spirit Sight trilogy, Spirit Lights trilogy, and the Spirit Song trilogy. But I didn't. So the question is, how do I break it up? And you just can't simply break a book that follows the correct structure and have it follow the correct structure. So um, basically split it in half, and so I have um, Spirit Sight Volume One,
Book one,
and
volume one.
right, and the idea is because it's Volume One, the reader knows, okay, this isn't the full story, right? So
Correct.
Spirit Sight Volume One kind of tells the story of Minna up to the point where she finds her spirit guide. Um, but
She
it
has
leaves
not yet saved her sister.
right, it leaves other plot lines kind of hanging in the air.
And
So
the
it's
saving the sister piece was at the very beginning. That, in fact, was the inciting incident for her to leave,
right,
was her sister being taken. She was safe. She got away. Her sister was taken by the Inquisition. That pushed her out
yeah,
of her life.
right. And then Spirit Sight Volume Two is her rescuing her sister after she finds her spirit guide.
Yes.
So the problem is that the first book leaves certain couple of plot lines in the air; they're not resolved at all. And the second one kind of starts in the middle of things. You feel like you're just jumping into the middle of the book. It doesn't have that structure, the lead up. So that's
But
why I
well,
called it.
didn't you do at the very beginning what you've done in quite a few of your books, which was an intro,
Yeah, I did a prologue,
a prologue?
which I think is awesome.
It's so good.
Yeah, it's the
And it
guy who
kind of
lives in a.
fits in, right? It fits in with the narrative of the Alaos being a storytelling people.
That's right.
So
Yeah,
they're in a tavern, and there's
yeah,
this guy who doesn't show up anywhere else who's telling the story
yeah.
of
10 years later,
right,
right?
which
And
gives
it's a,
the reader kind of the sense of, oh, this is a big story that goes over multiple years and that it is embedded in a larger structure.
yeah. So I think I did the best I could, um, given the situation, but it's a little bit confusing because I have the Spirit Song trilogy, which is
Mhm.
actually going to end up being 6 books.
6 books. I would prefer you say series, the Spirit
I know,
Song series.
but it says right there trilogy,
I
right?
know.
So, and I was in the middle of Spirit
It's a
Light.
rebranding issue.
I know I was in the middle of Spirit Light when they asked me to break Spirit Sight into 2 books, and I was working really hard to make it shorter, so I didn't have the same problem. And so when they asked me to do that, I'm like, awesome! Right now I can like stretch out. Um, so
Right.
I'm going to end up with a trilogy that has 6 books.
6 books. So you
Yeah,
will have Spirit Sight, Volume 1, Volume 2, Spirit Light, Volume 2, Book 1,
Volume
Book
One,
2,
Volume Two. Volume One comes out August 1st.
right. But it is Book 2, Volume 1,
Volume
Volume 2.
One and Two.
And then Spirit Song, which is Book 3, Volume 1, Volume 2.
Yeah.
So, for those of you who love a deep dive epic fantasy, strap on because
I
there
know.
is plenty. And we haven't even talked about, which is our next discussion, the prequels, which do not follow by any stretch these, um, and I'm
Per-
not saying
yeah,
tropes, the
the
structure.
prescribed structures, right? Tropes are a different topic.
No,
We can
they
get
don't.
into tropes in another podcast, right? So, um, so I was writing Spirit Sight, and I'm thinking, well, how did this peaceful people start to fight back? And that's where Argren Blue. I don't actually happen to have that book available, but that's where that book came from, and that's when Deb and I started writing together.
Hmm.
Um, and at that point, I was starting to feel pretty confident in my writing, and I
As
stopped
you
worrying
should.
about everybody else's prescriptions. It's like these aren't rules; they're more like guidelines,
Guidelines.
right? So I didn't. worry so much about the structure in Argren Blue. Now, it turns out that depending on how you interpret the events in the book, it's sort of close to the structure, but it also violates a lot of rules.
Hmm.
But people love this book, right?
Oh
No
yeah.
one's reading it, but the people who read
Plenty of
it
people are reading it,
love
they're
it.
just not leaving reviews. But, yeah, and Dzultai has had, like, universally, that's the next one in the series of the prequel books, of
Right. So you
which
have
there will
Argren
be
Blue,
4,
and then that book leads to two books, the
2
Zoltai,
books.
and then in a parallel book that we're working on now is called Ostera, which we've talked
Right.
about in previous podcasts. Um,
Yes.
Neither one of those books really follows that the
No.
prescribed structure, um, but uh, they're amazing books. They really
Mhm.
are. Um,
Well, and
and
the main thing about those books is there is the, and we've talked about this before, the overarching structure or the
yeah,
overarching story, which has to do with a peaceful people who rebel against an authoritarian culture and the cracks that are in that authoritarian culture that allow for a rebirth, a new way of everybody living.
yeah,
It's fantasy.
right.
Like, I really wish that would happen in our real lives, but at least we
But
can.
maybe those kind of things happen, but they're in a much grander scale than we see. But I think
Yeah,
what happened was after Argent Blue, we started to see that overarching story,
right.
and the Spirit Song Saga, and so these books, the Zoltai and Ostera, are starting to tell, are realizing that, we're realizing, and the books kind of depict that a piece of the bigger story, right?
Yes,
So they don't actually have to follow that
right.
story structure, the prescribed story structure, as much as they have to fit within the overall saga.
Yeah. And part of it too that to me is really important is you could read Spirit Song, like I'm assuming from Spirit Sight, Book One, Volume One through Spirit Song, Book Two, Volume Two, and have an epic, like get the whole story, have an epic experience, really feel all of that. But if this to me, in a weird way, feels a little like those of you who are Tolkien fans, like Silmarillion, although it actually has a story. It's not just a bunch of dates and whatever, but the deep, 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 deep backstory. If you want to get the deep backstory, the prequels are a great place to start, but also Ross's short stories. Many of them pull up, or the reader magnet, which we have for those of you who sign up for for
The mailing
the,
list.
the mailing list, yeah, can get the reader magnet, which talks about 2 characters that are in Spirit Light that um, it tells their backstory. So
Yeah.
yeah, these fill in and make richer that world, but you can get it without that. But for the like super nerdy people who really like that deep
Mhm.
dive, that's part of what these. But I will say those other books, the prequel books, also kind of stand alone in a
Oh yeah.
pretty good way, right?
Yeah, I think they stand alone. But for example, in Spirit Sight, you know that there's this woman and kind of in the background who's kind of manipulating events. You meet her
Reagan,
in Spirit Sight Volume Two, but the prequels tell you what she's been doing for the last 10 years, right? And
how
how
she
she
ended
has,
up in a position of
yeah,
manipulating all the events.
yeah, yeah.
Why she started doing that.
So
Yeah.
it gives you a lot more depth. Um,
Yes.
so you could, and I have a page on my website that talks about the order that you should read these books, but you could read the trilogy itself, and if you buy it first, and if you do that, you're going to get the maximum reveal, right? You're going to have
Yeah.
the surprise twist. Um, or you could start with the prequels and read those first, and you won't have as much. of the plot twists in the trilogy, but you'll know more than the characters, right? Which
Yeah.
sometimes is
Yeah, it just
also
depends on
good.
your reading style, like what you're interested in, but either way works. So, but
Yep.
that is one of the reasons why the structure of the books is different for those prequels because they're not standalone. They are supporting the broader story.
Right. Mhm.
We
Yep.
are at 15 minutes,
15 minutes.
so
Yeah, we said all we're gonna do is 15 minutes. So we're
that's
done.
all we're doing today.
Yep. Bye.
Bye. See you later.